Welcome to the stage, Head of AI and Generative AI Policy for Europe, Middle East, and Africa at Amazon Web Services, Sasha Rubel.
Thank you. Hi, Summit. Very happy to be here. I don't bite, and this is going to be a 60-minute extravaganza. So for those of you who are in the back and you feel like you want to get closer, I encourage you to come closer. So first of all, I'm super excited to be here to talk with you about artificial intelligence and how responsibility and innovation from the perspective of Amazon Web Services go hand in hand. It's a big debate right now. Do we innovate or do we ensure safety and responsibility? And I want to walk you through a little bit the thinking around what we're doing with regards to AI for social impact and how that's linked more broadly to thinking about responsibility. But first, I want to kind of take you through my own personal journey about how I got to AI to frame this conversation. And I just want to say this is my first time at Summit. I'm super excited to be here. And in the past 24 hours, I've had some amazing conversations with all of you, learning about the incredible innovations that you guys are working on that harness AI for social impact. But the number one question that I've gotten in most of the conversations that I've had is responsible AI. Does that really exist? And those questions came to me early in the evening, but also at 2 a.m. last night. So I think that there's a kind of general concern around what responsibility looks like in the rapid adoption of AI. And I want to walk you through a little bit some of the complexity and ambiguity that we're navigating at AWS in collaboration with researchers, with scientists, and with technologists and policymakers as well. There's no easy answer to this. And anybody that tells you that there's an easy answer, do not trust them. There are very challenging trade-offs that are being talked about on issues like copyright, data protection, intellectual property. One of the conversations that I had yesterday with one of you who's probably sitting in the audience right now was about the question of health data. And he was telling me, look, I want to do all of these really cool innovations with health and AI, but I can't get the data to train my model. And so these kinds of trade-offs are where I want to focus in the around 60-minute journey that we'll have together today. But before diving into that dimension of responsibility and AI for social impact, I want to share with you a little bit about how I came to AI, because it's important in framing the conversation and the emphasis that I'll place on the use cases that I'll share with you today. So I'm a doctor in infectious disease by training. And when I finished university, I moved to West Africa to work for the Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health under a Fulbright. And I was working in Nigeria and Mali on questions related to AIDS relief in the framework of PEPFAR. And more, when I was working there, I realized this isn't just a medical problem. This is a cultural challenge. And then I started looking in the cultural dimension, and I realized this isn't actually just a cultural challenge. It's about putting the power of the technological tools necessary for people to change their lives in their hands, so that they're not just consumers of technology, but also creators of technology. And this realization came to me from listening to the communities that I was working in Nigeria and in Mali, where they were saying all of these people are coming in from France, the United States, and England, thinking that they have the solution, but they're not listening to the solution that we need. And so it really encouraged me to think through how can we approach local development by working backwards from what's going on the ground. And the number one thing that these communities asked me for were tools. Tools that would help them use technology, and this is around the beginning of the smartphone, that would allow them to use their telephones to access information around health, to access personalized healthcare. Part of that was also increasing literacy so that they could engage with accessing this information. And I completely shifted and left my work in infectious disease and started to work in AI. And when I started to work in AI, my PhD research looked at the questions of imagination and how artificial intelligence could help underrepresented communities, particularly in West Africa and in indigenous communities that were living on an island between Papua New Guinea and Australia, to reimagine their histories, to appropriate the stories of their histories, but also to use their imagination to project possible futures. And this was something that was really important in my journey in terms of thinking about the possibility of AI. And particularly one day, I was outside of Timbuktu in the Sahara Desert talking to a Malian filmmaker who said to me, Sasha, I dream every day that somebody will finance a film that I would like to make of a Tuareg nomad climbing a giant tea kettle in the middle of the desert to talk about the power of imagination, but nobody will ever fund me. And fundamentally, what I see AI doing is democratizing access not only towards using these tools to develop life-saving solutions, but also democratizing access to make sure that we have the capability to do what is fundamentally the most human in all of us, which is create, which is imagine, and which is collectively transform the futures that we want to develop. After I did that research, I moved to UNESCO, where I led UNESCO's work and the UN's work more broadly on artificial intelligence to develop the first global framework around responsible AI and ethical AI. Part of that work, I grew up in West Africa, so you'll hear a lot about this in the talk. It's something that I care a lot about in terms of closing the digital divide and the question of access. Part of that work was looking at how we could use AI deployed in the Sahel for counterterrorism purposes and for transitions of countries towards democracy. And I started while I was in West Africa working with governments to develop what we call startup acts, how to support local innovation ecosystems on the ground. And oftentimes in these conversations, the private sector was completely absent. Same thing when I moved back to Paris. I'm French by origin, so you'll hear sometimes that my vocabulary in English, I may say a French word once in a while. I noticed that in the work that we were doing to get 195 countries to agree on a framework for ethical AI, which you have to imagine a closed-door room with Russia, Iran, China, Canada, and other countries trying to agree on what responsible AI looks like. I realized that in these conversations, the stakeholder group that would be impacted by this recommendation, notably the private sector, was not in the room. And so after I finished this work with the UN, I said, you know what? I would like to be in the center of where a lot of this innovation is happening and understand from the inside how industry is thinking about responsible AI and what are they doing. And I left after 15 years of the UN, and the number one question that I got from all of my great friends in the public sector, in governments, and in the UN was, how could you? You've gone to the dark side. And one of the things that I've been pleasantly surprised by in the 3 years that I've been at AWS is actually there's a lot of light in the private sector. And the number one thing that I have learned in sitting inside of industry and in conversations with CEOs of companies, including my own, is that there's a general understanding that just because it's technologically feasible doesn't mean we should build it. And that's the guiding principle of the work that I'd like to share with you today, that just because it's technologically feasible doesn't mean we should build it, but also that fundamentally responsibility drives trust, that trust drives adoption, and that adoption fundamentally drives innovation. So circling back to what I was sharing in the beginning, the conviction that there is no innovation, in fact, without responsibility. The main blocker that I see today is the question of trust. There is a lack of trust in this technology. People are afraid of it. People don't understand it. People don't understand, for example, that generative AI builds on a history of innovation in AI that comes out of, fundamentally, World War II. And this is what excites me. Many people think about the beginnings of AI attributed to Alan Turing, who ended World War II by cracking Enigma and the code. And so fundamentally, the roots of artificial intelligence are linked to the roots of peace, but there's a lot of work to do. And Alan Turing famously said, we can only see a short distance ahead of us, but we see plenty of things there that needs to be done. And I want to share with you a little bit about what we're doing. But first, I want to contextualize this fear around AI in the history of innovation and share two examples with you. one of the conversations that I've had over and over again in the past 24 hours here at Summit is also, will AI take my job? No, but AI will take the job of somebody who isn't using AI or isn't experienced in using AI, and a lot more jobs will come about that don't exist today. My niece, who's 18 years old, wants to be a prompt engineer. Without telling you how old I am, when I was in college, prompt engineer was definitely not on the curricula. And so these kinds of innovations and jobs are going to be created more than we can ever imagine, and it will transform the ways in which we think about creativity. But, for example, when the printing press was invented, people freaked out. The monks who were responsible for reproducing these books burned or broke a lot of the printing presses, saying this is going to exterminate all of the work that we are able to do. But fundamentally, what the printing press did is open up access to information, create a publishing industry, and allowed many people who wanted to be authors to be able to be authors. First example. Second example, when the Jacquard loom was invented, which was a loom that allowed weavers to weave textile in a much more productive way, the workers in the weaving factories took off their boots, in French sabots, and threw their boots at the loom to break the loom, convinced that this would be the end of the textile industry. It's actually where the word sabotage comes from the shoes that people took off to break this tool. But fundamentally what it did is create an entirely new kind of textile industry, and also by extension, fashion industry. So 2 examples in terms of the history of innovation and technology, and I'm convinced that we're going to move from technology for good to AI for good. But AI for good, again, isn't something that's new. So we have deep learning, reinforcement learning, unsupervised learning, and transformers. We've been working in this space for more than 25 years. But one of the things that changed everything around the world in around 24 hours is the large-scale access to large language models. What fundamentally changed in terms of large language models, and why were we at an inflection point? 2 fundamental reasons. One is the question of access to large-scale data, and the other is access to compute. And so these 2 kind of things combined are the reason why the advent of large language models ricocheted across the world in less than 24 hours. But that ricochet also led to some really exciting innovations almost immediately, and I want to share some of them with you. I'm convinced that AI can be used to address, and is being used already, to address some of the world's hardest problems. I flew here from Paris via Madrid, and on Monday I was with the President of France talking about what he's hosting, which is called the AI Action Summit in February of 2025. And the President of France said something that I really loved, which is we spend a lot of time talking about misuse. What are the risks of misuse, of risks related to existential challenges, related to safety? And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we don't spend enough time talking about misuse. What are all of the use cases that we could be developing if we had, for example, a framework to support open source access to AI, like what we're doing with Hugging Face? Or had access to, for example, training data or data sets at a large scale in local languages, noting that in sub-Saharan Africa, where I grew up, less than 1% of training data is in local African languages, which means that the AI that is being developed isn't fundamentally going to be helping the large majority of communities that aren't speaking in English, that aren't speaking in French, and that aren't speaking in Chinese. And so these are the questions that keep me up at night. This question of focusing on misuse. And these are a couple of examples that I find particularly exciting in terms of what we can do to scale. So the work that we do at AWS and beyond, I would say in the majority of industry, is guided by the Sustainable Development Goals, which is kind of a compass of where industry and the public sector would like to go together to solve what has been identified as some of the biggest challenges that exist today. And I want to talk a little bit about an example that I find really inspiring with regards to health. So I sit in the advisory council of the Irish government related to AI. I have no French or Irish accent, but I'm a complete European mutt. And one of the things that I hear all the time in Ireland from ministers and counterparts in the government is, what can we do to leverage AI to address some of the health crises that exist, including in the global north? And there's a really exciting innovation that's happening in AI for healthcare that looks specifically at how AI can help us detect what is completely missable by the human eye. There's a startup called Serginex, which is based out of Dublin, which is using AI to identify underrepresented brain damage in children. Many of you may not know, but 1 in every 200 newborns actually have some degree of brain injury. Cerebral palsy is one of the biggest brain injuries that exists that goes undetected in infants. And actually, by using AI, we can interpret EEG data, allowing almost near instant escalations for abnormal results. This is more cost-effective, it's not intrusive, and it allows us to identify these kinds of challenges in a way that's efficient and in a way that's done at scale. And I want to talk for a second about the question of at scale, because one of my favorite parts of my job is talking to startups and customers, particularly in the global majority, about what they're facing in terms of blockers to AI adoption. And one of the things that they talk about a lot, and in addition to the questions of regulatory blockers, is the question of being able to move from proof of concept to scale. So there's this idea in the development world, but also in the AI world, of pilotitis, or proof of concept purgatory. And so one of the things that we've been working on is to say, what are the really exciting use cases that exist, and how can we scale them and make them available in other parts of the world that need this? And this is something that we're working on with Serginex. A key kind of outcome of the work that we've been doing with Serginex is the conviction that data, unfortunately, remains a privileged asset. A lot of that data, particularly health data, is either inaccessible or unavailable. I have a colleague who I work with who has a rare genetic disease. She's Czech. She lives in Sweden. And one of the conversations that I have on a regular basis with her is she says, Sasha, nobody in Sweden has my rare genetic disease. Nobody. I would love to be able to share my health data with other people in the European Union who have the same challenge, so that scientists can advance the research behind treating this rare genetic disease. But from a regulatory standpoint, she can't. And so this is one of the things that we see in terms of blockers to AI adoption, is the regulatory uncertainty that exists for innovators, particularly startups who spend around 30% of their funding in Europe on compliance costs, that doesn't allow them to clearly understand how they can develop and deploy these solutions in a way that respects the legislative framework that they're living in, but also that allows them to scale. So the legislative framework in the EU is very different than the legislative framework in the United States. But fundamentally, companies like Serginex want to be able to scale and make their resources and their innovations available. And so the need for interoperable approaches and regulatory certainty is one of the key areas of emphasis that I'm looking at today in my work, particularly as it concerns questions related to data sharing. And this is really where we see the next kind of conversation on AI for good going, is we need to democratize access to data in order to produce good AI. Because garbage in, garbage out. Good stuff in, good stuff out. We need quality data in order to train these models so that fundamentally they can help people. The other aspect and importance of quality data is the question of going from unstructured data to structured data. So there's an enormous amount of data that exists and that is circulating out there. And one of the things that I find exciting is moving from this unstructured data to structured data that allows us to draw wisdom and insights and actions from this structured data. One of the examples in terms of taking away insights from structured data, and actually the use case that made me leave the public sector to join the private sector, is this use case. So many people here today will be thinking about the risks of AI. They'll be thinking, in general, top of mind is the questions of misinformation and disinformation, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But the second thing that people ask me about is gender-based violence facilitated by technology and child sexual abuse material online. How do we deal with what's called CSAM? And how can we use AI to address some of the challenges related to the large-scale distribution of child sexual abuse material online? And we need a magnet in order to do that, because there's a lot of it. And the magnet is machine learning. So one of the things that we've been working on with Thorn and Spotlight is finding ways to identify, using both AI and also facial recognition technology deployed via computer vision, to find victims of child sexual abuse, but also of sexual and human trafficking. This disproportionately affects women and underage children. And actually, by using AI, we've identified more than 18,000 victims, including more than 6,000 children. With Safer, and again in the collaboration with Thorn, we found a way to use AI to identify more than 1 million child sexual abuse material files on customer platforms. This is extraordinary because the people who are perpetuating CSAM are hiding images in other formats, like .txt. And actually, by using AI, you can, at scale, identify and remove this material online, identify the perpetrators, and also repatriate the victims to their families. When I talk with law enforcement agencies that are using these tools, they tell me that this kind of technology has actually sped up by more than 65% their capacity to go through files and determine and identify both the perpetrators and the victims, because in reality, law enforcement agencies are completely overwhelmed. And so these kinds of tools are completely transforming the ways in which we think about having technology and humanity working hand in hand. I have to say, this is, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, my first time at Summit, and one of the things that's blown me away is I feel like being here is like being in a place with a whole bunch of rare birds, but the rare birds are these extraordinary human beings that are all doing really meaningful and impactful work. A lot of you yesterday shared with me some of the incredible work that you're looking at in terms of deploying and developing AI systems that addressed some of the biggest health challenges in the world today. Some of you are looking at how AI can be deployed to address the climate crisis. Many of you are concerned about the carbon footprint of AI, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and what we can do to make sure that we are developing small language models instead of large language models, and develop for impact, but develop in a way that's sustainable. But I want to share with you something that's really dear to my heart, which is the question of how AI is transforming the ways in which we think about humanitarian action. So I was on the ground in multiple post-conflict and post-disaster areas, particularly again in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the biggest comments that I got from UN agencies and government development agencies alike was, we don't have the data necessary and quickly enough to make informed decisions about where and how to intervene. And I want to share with you a little bit about what we're doing in that space.
Buildings collapsing in seconds. People trapped on remote mountain ledges. The earthquake hit Taiwan 8 a.m. local time.
De ontem nós mostramos esse cavalo.
President Gustavo Petro declared a natural disaster to transfer more resources to fight the fires and pleaded for international help.
Climate change is increasing global temperatures, causing higher sea levels and increasing the frequency, duration, and intensity of rainfall, storm surge, and wildfire events. The need to respond to these evolving threats has never been higher. Leveraging artificial intelligence and accurate data is a key way to speed up response times and get assistance to affected communities. The need to gain efficiencies where possible is more acute than ever. This past year, only 40% of humanitarian funding needs were met. Meanwhile, record levels of food insecurity persist due to protracted crises and new shocks. Across 48 countries, over 238 million people are facing high levels of acute food insecurity. Help NGO and AWS are working to bridge that gap, leveraging cutting-edge technology, low-cost connectivity solutions, open-source data, and AI. Our teams are enabling field operators to focus on humanitarian development and peacekeeping needs with tools that allow for rapid, accurate, data-driven decision-making where it's needed most.
So for me, this is, again, a very concrete example of the ways in which we talk a lot about better policies and better coordinated action for social impact, but fundamentally what's needed there is good data and good technology. In the beginnings of generative AI, I was playing around with different tools. And I was playing around with the foundation model that isn't housed by AWS. And I said, who is Sasha Rubel? And they said, Sasha Rubel is a man. So, I am not. I identify as a woman. You can use her and she as pronouns. She's a man. She's a Russian spy, which I also assure you I am not, although that's what spies would say. And thirdly, that I am a chess coach. And I promise you, I actually have no idea how to play chess. And so there's a lot of questions around hallucinations and accuracy of these tools, which is one of the major blockers to adopting them. So I took you through a little bit of a journey with regards to questions of social impact, and now I want to take you through a little bit of a journey of what I see as the other side of that to unleash the opportunities and potential of social impact, which is the belief and conviction that responsible AI is possible. It's super complicated, it's very complex, it's very ambiguous. Nobody has all the answers, but we're working on them. And that in parallel to that, there are lots of really exciting ways that artificial intelligence can be used to actually address the challenges represented by AI itself. So one of the key takeaways that I have in conversations, particularly with startups, is that most companies that I talk to, the first two things that they raise are questions of responsible AI, and the second thing that they raise is questions of sustainable innovation. And so there's actually research that shows that more than 84% of executives see responsible AI as a priority and an imperative, but in reality, only 25% of them have programs to actually address the questions of responsibility. Despite this massive gap, employees are already using generative AI. And these statistics are a little bit older, so I would imagine that in reality, these statistics are even higher. So 43% of working professionals are using generative AI applications to accomplish tasks at work. 68% of them have done so without telling their employee. I imagine both of those statistics are a little bit higher now. How many of you are using a foundation model to help you draft emails? And yeah, exactly. How many of you are doing it without telling your employee on your phone or on your computer? Okay, everybody's too afraid to raise their hands. Your bosses aren't in this room. And so this is like a real challenge, is that in reality, people are using these tools, but they're not necessarily doing it in a responsible way. And above all, a lot of workers are inputting confidential information into these models, which could eventually compromise information of your company. One of the things that I'm most excited about in terms of research is actually building on the previous slide, the main communication that I share with CEOs and executives in companies is that you need to operationalize your approach to responsible AI, not only to make sure that your employees are using generative AI in a responsible way, but also fundamentally because of the return on investment of responsible AI. So Claude, which is a foundation model of Anthropic, a company that AWS has invested in, one of their approaches is to really look at safety by design. And one of the things that we've heard on a regular basis is that people want to be using tools that they know are safe and that aren't telling other people that they're a Russian spy. And that in the long run, responsibility pays off. So it's not only just a social and moral imperative, it's also an economic imperative to have this responsibility by design approach because it raises the profit impact of the deployment of your AI services. People want to be able to use tools that they can trust. But there are a lot of people that, as I mentioned, are really concerned about responsible AI and AI more broadly. And these are some of the key concerns: that it could hurt companies' legal rights, that the results could be wrong, as I shared, that information could be shared with the public, or that it's detrimental for humanity. And that's something that we're trying to address through sharing these use cases, but also by educating individuals, but also policymakers, about what AI is and isn't. AI is not magic. And as human beings, what we don't understand, we're afraid of. And so a huge emphasis of our work with policymakers and also citizens around the world has been about helping them to understand what AI is and isn't, but also helping them to understand what it means to develop and deploy technology responsibly. As I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, one of the biggest challenges that we see today in the development of responsible AI is the challenge of balancing innovation with emerging risks and challenges. Why is this so different than the work that's been going on for more than 20 years around responsible AI? It's because foundation models are broad and open-ended. So before you had traditional AI models, so you could ask this traditional AI model, should I give a loan to this person? Which I would say is high-risk AI, and so would the EU AI Act. And then you have generative AI models where you have multiple use cases where you can ask open-ended questions like generating the report of a meeting. And so questions around how we define principles of responsible AI, like fairness, are a science that's evolving, and the state of the art and the standards that are needed in order to accompany these questions are still in development while we are building the plane but flying it at the same time. And so this is an area of focus for us in terms of what we're thinking about with regards to responsible AI, notably around 4 key challenges. So these are the major 4 challenges that I hear every day, both from policymakers and startups, is questions around toxicity and safety, around veracity, so hallucinations, incorrect information, around questions related to data privacy, particularly in the health space, and questions around intellectual property. For example, if you say, show me a painting of a cat in the style of Picasso, is this copyright infringement or not? I was really inspired, I think Jason Silva is in the room, by a conversation that I had with Jason yesterday, talking about AI and the future of creativity, and what that might mean in terms of putting the power of AI in the hands of creatives everywhere so that they can, for example, rethink what it means to engage with historical figures in philosophy. He's doing a screening this evening on psychedelic puppets, which I suggest you don't miss because it's a great encapsulation of the ways in which AI can actually empower creativity and not endanger it. I was in Italy a couple weeks ago with an artist who's developed a large language model trained solely on his own artwork to help him think through what the future of his own creativity looks like in cooperation with, but not replaced by, an AI. These are hard questions. But as we learn about generative AI, there are lots of new sciences and policies that are already being created to address these challenges. And I want to share a little bit about what we're doing in this space and how we're using AI to help. So we're looking at how to use AI to carefully develop and curate training data. So deploying AI to think through in the massive scale of training data sets that are used to train large language models, how can we make sure that we're not training those large language models on, for example, my 18-year-old niece's social media posts, in which case you would get very bad French in your training model. And so these kinds of tools are really exciting in terms of the ways in which we can actually use AI to help make better AI. Use case specific testing. So many of you are coming from the United States. I'm sure you have followed what was developed as the White House voluntary AI commitments that we signed last July. And one of the things that's included in those commitments is the commitment to red teaming and adversarial testing. And so one of the pieces of science that we're working on is how to standardize red teaming so that you can test the foundation model that you will be deploying for the risks related to specific use cases. If you're using a large language model to make a summary of a meeting, it's not going to be the same risk as if you're using this large language model to potentially detect a tumor that can't be seen by the naked eye in your lungs. And so the use case aspect is something that's really important. Guardrail models, which I'll talk about in just a minute in more depth. Red teaming linked to the use case specific testing. Watermarking. Retrieval augmented generation, and I'll do a deep dive in some of these in just a minute. Output attribution of pieces of training data, because many times when people are using these large language models, they want to know what sources are being used in this output. That's a really important dimension, and it's one of the areas that we're working on. I was super inspired by a talk that happened, I believe it was yesterday, on AI and the future of education. And this kind of attribution of questions related to sources of training data is really key in thinking through how we can encourage AI adoption in education going forward. One of the pieces of science that I'm most excited about, because fundamentally I'm a total geek, is this question of model disgorgement and machine learning. If any of you haven't heard about model disgorgement, it's looking at how we can address risk related to data privacy and protection and information that should be encrypted and anonymized, while making sure that we can have the training data necessary to innovate specifically in the health space. There's some great research going on that. There's also some great research published by Anthropic called Mapping the Mind of a Large Language Model that looks at how we can map the ways in which large language models develop outputs, and based on that, embed safety and responsibility by design. Differential privacy linked to disgorgement, and then also something that we call sharding training data. So making sure that certain kinds of data sets do not include certain kinds of data. I want to do a deep dive very briefly in terms of what all of these high-level ideas mean in practice. Because one of the biggest learnings for me, moving from the public sector to the private sector, is when you talk with policymakers and you say, oh, we think transparency, accountability, explainability, all these principles, they're very important dimensions of responsible AI development and deployment. Every single policymaker that you talk to will say, yes, we totally agree. But if you talk to a software engineer and say, can you please develop for me an algorithm that's transparent by design, or can you please develop an algorithm that's explainable or accountable? And I have these conversations with our engineering teams all the time. They look at me and they say, Sasha, what the hell are you talking about? And so this kind of language doesn't mean anything to the majority of engineers that are actually developing these solutions. And so what we've done is we've taken a kind of four-pronged approach to thinking through this. The first is really placing an emphasis on moving from principles to practice, because there's general consensus of what these principles look like, and I'll talk about them briefly in just a minute. But the other dimension is making sure that everybody along the value chain, including designers, developers, and deployers, are empowered with the knowledge necessary to make sure that they understand what these principles mean in practice. I would just like to say that one of the things that most excites me about Summit is that I've seen a lot of really great talks on AI, and a lot of them are by women. And one of the dimensions of this work is also ensuring that there's diversity in the teams that are developing these solutions. And there's science that shows that actually diverse teams make better AI solutions and innovations 73% of the time. So if you don't have diversity in the teams that are building these solutions, you're ultimately not going to have a good product, because the teams need to be as diverse as the communities that are going to be the end users of these tools. And that's really the guiding principle of the ways in which we think about diversity and operationalizing responsibility, is making sure that teams are diverse. And I would say here, it's not just about having women at the table. It's also about having philosophers, artists, engineers, lawyers, anthropologists around the table, so that we can have a systems thinking approach of what responsibility looks like by design and in practice. We also take the approach that we integrate responsibility across the AI lifecycle. So many of you will know that there are lots of companies that have head responsible AI in their companies. We don't have a head of responsible AI, because we think that responsibility is everybody's responsibility, and that there's no end point in terms of where that responsibility lies between design, development, and deployment. Education, which we see is really key. We actually found in the research that we undertook that 61% of businesses around the world see a lack of digital skills as one of the main blockers to adopting AI in their companies. But when we talked to employees said, we would love to learn new skills, but we don't have the time and the classes are expensive. And so what we've done is developed more than 80 classes that teach people not only what AI is and isn't, but also what responsible AI means. Because let's be clear, not everybody in this room needs to be an AI ML programmer, but everybody in this room needs to understand what AI is, how we're already using it, and how we can deploy it and use it responsibly. So that responsibility dimension has been a really important part of our work. Interestingly, in this research, just as an anecdote, the demographic that was most interested in learning new AI skills was actually the demographic that was closest to retirement. It was people 60 and above, where they were like, we definitely want to learn about AI. And I thought that was super interesting, because it shows that the older generation, without saying that 60 is old, the older generation acknowledges that actually your capacity to interact with and use AI will change the ways in which you interact with the world more broadly going forward. My 94-year-old father, who doesn't understand email and definitely didn't understand YouTube, uses a chatbot of a French public service to understand how to access his Social Security benefits. It's already extraordinary that my father can turn on and off a computer, and seeing him engage with this chatbot allowed him to engage with technology and get the information fundamentally that he needed in a much quicker way that he never would have been able to otherwise. And so I think this question of education is absolutely crucial. And the last dimension, advancing the science behind responsible AI, similarly to the slide that I shared earlier in terms of the work that we're doing around disgorgement, this place and space is moving super quickly. If you told me we would be where we are today, 24 months ago, I would have literally said you were hallucinating. And so it's really challenging to develop regulatory frameworks and state-of-the-art science safety protocols with a technology that's developing so quickly. And so a huge part of our emphasis is investing in the science behind how we can make sure that we can develop and deploy these technologies in a responsible way. We focus, as I mentioned, on education, but I want to deep dive a little bit into what we think about in terms of pillars of responsible AI. So the first is the questions of privacy and security, so making sure that we're using and protecting data and models. The second is safety, preventing harmful system output and misuse. And it's very interesting because one of the biggest conversations that we're having today at the international level with governments, because we've made commitments to test our models in a safety protocol, is yes, but test against what? What does safe mean? And Rob Reich, who's a brilliant American scientist teaching at Stanford and part of the US Safety Institute and NIST, keeps on calling for this question of metrology, which is we need to have internationally agreed approaches to measuring safety testing and what that means in practice. And that's a huge area of our emphasis now. One of the things that we've done to kind of operationalize these principles of privacy and safety is something called Guardrails for Amazon Bedrock, where and Bedrock, for those of you who may not be familiar, is the service that we make available at AWS that allows you a plethora of choice of the different models that you would like to use to deploy for your different AI solutions, because we recognize that you're going to want one AI model perhaps for a health use case that's optimized for accuracy, but you may want another kind of model if you're going to be using it for the public service chatbot that my father uses. And so this idea of choice is what motivated us to launch Amazon Bedrock. And so what we've done is we've launched guardrails that allow us to configure and filter harmful content, define and disallow denied topics. So if you ask for Sasha Rubel at Summit dancing until 2 in the morning, singing at the No Pizza Jam, this output will not allow it. And this is one of the ways in which you can filter the outputs using these kinds of guardrails. One of the things that we're working on in terms of advances in science is redacting sensitive information in foundation model responses, because we realize that one of the most promising areas of AI adoption in responsible AI is really the health sector. And many of you are working through and in this space trying to figure out how to do this in a responsible way. Our guardrails allow us to configure thresholds to filter out content in varying degrees. And this is something that we see as absolutely essential because, again, it's one of the biggest concerns that we hear from startups and companies of all sizes, is how do we make sure that if we're using this model and we adopt it in our company, that it doesn't return on sensitive issues or promote, for example, hate speech, gender bias, racial discrimination, or other elements. And so this is, again, one of the areas that I find particularly exciting, is how you can use AI to help address some of the challenges related to training on such large amounts of data. One of the biggest questions that I get every day from policymakers in the year of the most elections, I think, in the history of the world, is how can we make sure that AI-generated generative AI content is watermarked so that we can fight against misinformation and disinformation. And we were actually one of the first companies to develop an invisible watermark that would make it clear that this kind of content was synthetic and was not human. It's one of the biggest challenges that's happened in discussions amongst the US elections, but also in elections in the EU and beyond. One of the things that we're pushing for is to standardize this watermarking, because if we do watermarking one way and some of the other industry players do it in another, ultimately it's going to confuse the people who are using this content and trying to identify whether or not it is real or fake. Transparency is another element that we get asked about a lot, and it's one of the reasons why we launched something called AI service cards, because fundamentally, people who are thinking about adopting these models, they want to know, what can I use this model for? What are the service limitations? What are the design choices that we've made in terms of responsibility, and guidance fundamentally on how to deploy these solutions responsibly. So this is something that we launched several years ago, and we keep on iterating to make sure that it's updated to meet the most up-to-date kind of regulatory requirements that exist. We have other elements like robustness, fairness, explainability, veracity, and controllability. And this is embodied in the ways in which we have something called the foundation model evaluation with Amazon SageMaker Clarify. That's a mouthful. One of the things that we've done in this tool is to open source it, because we see open source as one of the preconditions to democratizing access. So you can use this tool on any kind of foundation model for free to evaluate these foundation models for risks linked to what we are guided by in terms of our principles. And you can use this tool also to help you choose which kind of use case is the best. We have other elements that I mentioned before, like explainability, veracity, and controllability. But fundamentally, all of this is guided by what we see as the overarching principle, which is a question of governance. So incorporating best practices across the AI supply chain. This is where there is the biggest blocker. So companies and organizations that want to think through responsibility, but that don't necessarily have the internal governance mechanisms in place to make sure that it's a reality. And it's one of the reasons why a large part of our work is accompanying organizations of all sizes and thinking through what that internal governance framework can look like and how AI can help keep track and monitor. I mentioned earlier that we really see responsible AI as everyone's responsibility, but that fundamentally the best practices to adopt generative AI responsibility are the same across the board. So defining use cases of how you'd like to use them, matching processes to risk, which is another real challenge because the risk that, for example, the EU AI Act outlines might not be the same risk as, for example, in the executive order of Biden. And so one of the things that we've been pushing for is saying, look, the innovators in this space, they don't want to be French champions or Moroccan champions or American champions. They want to be global champions. And for that, you need to have an internationally aligned approach of what high risk is and what it isn't. And so this kind of questions around risk is something that we see as super important. And then shared responsibility upstream and downstream, because there are certain elements that developers will know about, that designers will know about, or that deployers will know about. And we see the cooperation across that value chain as absolutely essential in terms of thinking through iterating ways in which we can deploy with social impact and deploy responsibly. And last, test, check, and measure and prioritize education, because this space is moving so quickly. It's one of the things that I like the most about my job is that I'm a perpetual learner in this space. If anybody tells you that they are a generative AI expert, also do not trust them, because the reality is that the science is moving extremely, extremely quickly. And education is one that we see as kind of a never-ending journey. I want to close just by saying that reflecting on what I was sharing earlier in terms of democratizing access to data, fundamentally, good AI needs good data. The only way you will have an AI tool that is deployed in a safe and responsible way that also has positive social impact is if you curate that data in an intentional way, not only by using some of the tools that I shared to make sure that any kind of bias is reduced, but also by ensuring the diversity of teams that make sure that we're thinking through not only the risks that exist, but also the opportunity. Good data needs good AI. So what I see in terms of the possibilities of AI is that when we're deploying AI systems, we can make better decisions and develop better policies for better lives. And fundamentally, that should be the mission of the innovation in this space. But for that to happen, again, the reciprocity between data and AI needs to exist. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, what this is all about is that good work needs good people. And the ways in which we deploy AI going forward will depend entirely on the people who end up making up this tech sector. I was having conversations yesterday evening, and somebody asked me what excites me the most about this space, and am I not afraid that artificial intelligence will take over the world? And I want to share with you an anecdote of a woman that I met who works in a government, a large one not far away from here, who is the chief data officer of this government. And she deployed a generative AI solution in this government at scale in a way that was absolutely incredible. And I asked her, how the hell did you do that? And she said, it's very simple. I went to 1,500 people in my organization, and I sat with 1,500 people, and I listened to them. And I asked them, what do you hate the most about your job? And then I used AI to map the overlaps of what people hated most about their job. And then I automated that. And she said, and now people are much happier because they don't need to spend their time writing briefings, writing executive notes, writing whatever else. And they can focus on what is the most exciting aspect of their job, but also what is the most exciting aspect about being human, which is their creativity. And so what I see as the future going forward is that if we continue to focus working backwards from the social impact that we would like to have, finding ways to leverage AI to have that social impact in a safe and responsible way, and training people to be able to think through what that kind of responsibility looks like, but also to continue to coming up with insanely courageous, bold, good ideas, many of them coming from the people sitting in this room today, we will end up with extraordinary AI. But at the end of the day, it depends on people, and it depends on our capacity to understand that fundamentally what this AI revolution will do is remind us very profoundly of what makes us human. And that is the note that I would like to leave you with, is because I do not think that we will be replaced by artificial intelligence. I think we need to be able to work with artificial intelligence to unlock some of the deepest passions that probably many people in this room have, which is to make the world a better place and to have a positive impact, but to also do it in a safe and responsible way at scale. And that this will return us to fundamentally what will always make us human, which is the capacity to create and to imagine, and the capacity to co-develop through this collective imagination a future that is tech-enabled, but that is human-centered. And I'll close just with a quote that I really love from William Gibson that says, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. So we need good work and good people, but we also need to make sure that we're not leaving communities behind in this revolution. And fundamentally, to not leave these communities behind, we need to democratize access to this technology in a safe and responsible way. We need to scale the innovations that many of you are working on in this room at a global level. And we need to come together across stakeholder groups, so industry, policy, civil society, and creatives, to think through what this tech-enabled and human-centered future looks like. So thank you very much. Thank you.